There we go. Okay. Howdy, y'all. How are you doing today? I am so thrilled to be here with you because we're going to be talking about all the secrets. We're also going to be talking about the secret problem of bad buildings and the keys you hold to fixing them. And we're going to be doing that by examining how the built environment, the built spaces around us, can affect our brain, our mood, our psychology, and our emotions. So we're also going to be answering the question of what the heck was happening in study hall all year. You want to know, I want to know, and we're going to figure it out. But in order to do that, we have to understand two terms. Now, the first one of these terms is neuroscience. Raise your hand if you're familiar with neuroscience. Okay, so a few of you. All you need to know about neuroscience for this presentation is that it's the study of how the brain responds to the external environment. So it's how your brain responds to the environment around you. Then we have our next term, which is architecture. And architecture is probably a little more straightforward. You've probably heard this one a few times. Architecture is the practice of shaping the environment around you. So you might be thinking, well, if neuroscience studies the environment and how our brain responds to the environment, and architecture is about shaping space and shaping the environment, can we use what we know about neuroscience to help inform what we build, to help us make better buildings architecturally? And the answer is yes, absolutely. Neuroarchitecture is a field that's emerged in the last 20 or so years. And what it does is it looks at the influence of neuroscience and the way our brain works on buildings. And specifically, it tries to figure out what about our brain and what about our psychology make it so that buildings are good or bad, or effective or not effective, or fun, happy, enjoyable places to be, or miserable places to be. And unfortunately, the findings from this kind of research that's happened in the last 20 years is still pretty limited to the circles of researchers who are doing the work, and it's not really available to the wider public. And that's really unfortunate because these principles are so simple and they can make any building better really easily, but they're definitely not accessible to the general public, and they're definitely not accessible to high school students. And high school students are actually some of the most at risk for being in buildings that are going to not be beneficial for their psychology or for their development. Many high schools were built before this research kind of came into the fold or the popular consciousness. So that means that a lot of high school campuses don't have natural light. A lot of them have really limited movement and mobility throughout their hallways. And a lot of them don't pay attention to principles that can pretty easily make their occupants feel better. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to get the ball rolling at Griffin and go ahead and start making some of these changes and showing you how to make these changes yourselves, because they're so easy and they're so fun to do, and they can make the space around you better. And the way I did this was I surveyed. So I looked at light, sound, social patterns, sight, and time. And I went through and I looked at these variables and I looked at how people responded to these variables. And I did that through all the surveys that you did this year. So whenever there was a survey that was handed out in study hall, that's what this is for. So in a very real sense, the information you're about to see comes from you. And without you and without your responses to these surveys, it wouldn't have been possible. So go ahead and pat yourself on the back for that. So to start understanding our psychology and how our psychology and our brain affects how we respond to spaces, we have to go back about 2 million years to the savannas of Eastern Africa. Now, our species came from the savannas, which means our greatest grandparents from way back when actually lived on these savannas, and that's when our brains were developing, when our brains were evolving, we were evolving for this space. So that means that in a very real sense, when you're in a Sears parking lot, you're looking behind you to see if there are any lions or tigers. And when you're running down the greenbelt on Barton Creek, your brain is subconsciously trying to find sources of fresh water. So you might be thinking, well, that seems a little strange. We've been out of the savannas for a long time, right? But on an evolutionary time scale, no, not at all. You can think of this as the progress bar of human evolution. And we only left the savanna 200,000 years ago. So that's a relatively recent development, and our brain is still back here. The way our psychology and our brain is set up is to keep us alive in spaces like this. So we can use that to help inform our buildings. And even more importantly, we know that based on our evolutionary history, we have certain preferences about the way buildings look because of the way our brain would have responded to the environment and risk in the environment millions of years ago. So we're gonna try a fun exercise. Type into the chat in like 1 or 2 words, what's good about the brick hall? Okay, windows, color, light. Yes, absolutely. Lots of cool windows, high ceilings. I'm seeing tons of windows. Awesome. Now go ahead and type in what is bad about the brick hall. Whoa, too fast. Okay, sound, too cold, right? Gray, that we can't be there, that's a good one. Small spaces, okay, cold, yeah, thin walls, pointy, there we go, that's a great one. So what you'll see is that there's really this undercurrent of common preference that everybody has based on the way that our brains work and based on the way that our brains are set up. And that can kind of even overpower individual preference. So although we might all have individual preferences about buildings and built spaces, we have a common kind of agreement on what works and what doesn't work about a space. And we can use that to our advantage. So if you want to make built spaces better, you have to consider three things. One is nature. Ensuring that nature is present and visible in all parts of the built environment is evolutionary design. This means making spaces for the way that our brain has evolved over time. And finally, paying attention to sensory thresholds. In other words, making sure a given environment isn't overstimulating or understimulating, and considering that people's sensory thresholds vary. We'll start with the first one, nature, as this is the easiest to understand and the most powerful. You can think about it like our species grew up in nature. So our brains are designed to work in natural environments. In fact, the part of our brain that deals with responding to natural places, the parahippocampal place area, say that 5 times fast, we'll call it the PPA from here on out, is laden with opiate receptors, which means that looking at nature makes us feel good. Also, in our modern life, we have one form of attention. It's focused attention and it's very intent. And for example, you're focusing on this presentation right now or focusing on the chat right now. But there's another form of attention that we seem to have lost somewhere in our evolutionary history, and that's called diffuse attention. So by being in nature, we can actually rely on this other form of attention, and you can think of it like a nutrient that's missing from our urban diets. Because when you are entirely focused on one single thing all the time, you don't have the chance to recharge and restore your attention. And this is part of a theory called Kaplan's attention restoration theory. So being in nature and having nature around us helps us restore our attention and return to our work more focused. And beyond that, it helps us just feel better generally because it promotes an opiate response in the brain. So by adding plants, both real and fake, to your school or built environment, by including natural views and a diversity of species, you can help people feel better in a space at virtually no cost. So the way I wanted to look at this in Griffin's built environment was I looked at sight, and I looked at what people could see and where they were distracted. So when students were distracted by natural sights, they felt a wide range of positive emotions. And this is consistent with the perception of nature and its ability to allow attention restoration. For example, 36.4% of students were distracted by natural sights throughout the course of their day. And these students returned to their work more relaxed, interested, and content than those that were distracted by other people or mechanical noises or sounds or sights or non-natural stimuli. Light rather, is yet another thing that we must take into account when we're considering nature in the built environment. So natural light and a connection to nature is obviously very important. However, this is where sensory thresholds come in, because if you don't consider that different people have different levels of stimulation that they can tolerate, you can actually hurt a space more than you can help it. Take, for example, the big room. The big room is full of big panel windows that get super bright during the day. But just because there's natural light and a connection to nature doesn't necessarily mean it works. It's hypothesized here that the glare is actually too intense during the day. So based on the strength of the light, students aren't able to see their paper and they feel more negative. Additionally, and kind of in the same vein, I wanted to look at sound. So people reported that the most frequent noise-related distraction on campus was conversation. That's 61.5% of people. And this causes a wide range of negative emotions. If you're in the commons or the big room, you can probably attest to this. However, students that reported being distracted by natural sounds didn't have these negative emotions. In fact, they were able to return to their work more recharged and restored. So I wanted to see if I could induce this effect in study hall by playing natural noises. So I launched a survey over the course of 2 weeks to measure the baseline. That means where people are normally and how they feel during study hall. And then I played nature noises to see if anything changed. And you can see here that stress actually went down and sociability went up. So people were less stressed and more social, and that's never a bad thing. However, this is where implementation is important, because our speaker actually broke in the middle of the test, and that resulted in more chaos and commotion than we were accounting for, which meant that people's productivity actually went down a little bit in that 3rd week. So it's very important in terms of implementing this stuff and making sure that you do it right. The next thing to consider that's incredibly important is evolutionary design, or designing for our evolutionary past. And we touched on this a little bit with the savanna, but it's important to clarify it because this is one of the easiest and most powerful things you can do to change your environment. You can see on the right, we have this wonderful picture of Joe Exotic being tackled by a tiger. And in a very real sense, this is how your brain feels all the time, whether you're aware of it or not. And this is why we don't like being in open, exposed areas, because it conveys a sense of threat. Even if it's not a conscious sense of threat, there's a sense of threat from being in wide open spaces without enclosure. So if you look at most of your Zoom screens right now, you're facing a wall or you're in an enclosed space. Nobody's carrying their computer out into the middle of a field or parking lot and just standing there. And that's because naturally, based on our evolutionary past, we seek places of prospect and refuge. That means that we're genetically programmed to prefer places that keep us sheltered and able to see out and see any threats that might be incoming. So it's really easy to make spaces work in this way. You can provide walls to cling to, break up wide open areas with enclosure, and you should never be forcing occupants to turn their back on wide open spaces. And you might be saying, well, wait, Craig, that sounds awfully familiar because that sounds like our big room. And it is. In the big room, everyone faces away from the door, there are people behind them, and there's nowhere to turn to feel sheltered. But the thing is, it's remarkably easy to help people feel more comfortable in this environment. All it takes is just changing some tables, rearranging some tables in shapes that promote enclosure that help people feel sheltered and safe, and adding plants to bring the benefits of nature into the classroom. Additionally, and in the same vein, rounding edges and curving paths helps people feel more comfortable because evolutionarily, sharp points conveyed a sense of danger. So people like to take curved paths and they like curved surfaces more than pointy surfaces. So if you look back, you can also see that social patterns are really important. It's not just about how a space is set up, but it's also about how people use the space and the programs that are in place to help people use that space. You can see here, people actually like having a degree of control over their environment. And what this means is they like to have a sense of agency and they like to know that they can change their seating space. You can see here, people prefer a commons in the default arrangement with individual tables because they feel like they have more control, and it makes them 73.9% more productive, which is huge. Just by giving people a little bit of room to do their own thing, we can see a tangible benefit. I spoke with this wonderful, wonderful human being up here, Dr. Upali Nanda, and what she said is that there's a level of agency that's not provided to students in the high school environment, but that's necessary developmentally. So it's why it's really important to yield control to students and to let them shape their spaces in the way that they need to. So going back to our brick hall, you can see, and these slides were prepared in advance of your answers, that the things you brought up are actually present in this diagram. So there are chances to see people and nature through the windows. Everyone talked about windows, and that's huge. And these sharp angles, these sharp points convey a sense of threat. So you can really see that there are these things that you can identify universally that people will point out in built spaces, and we can make them better pretty easily. So in terms of the implementation, in terms of how to make spaces better, there are 5 simple steps. For one, if you've seen these and you're like, wow, these are kind of cool, I want to help make Griffin or my home or my office or my parents' workplace better and more in line with our psychology, you need to design for who's actually there and who's going to be using the space. You need to survey beforehand to see what's gone wrong, and you need to let these principles of neuroscience guide your decisions. A lot of times things work when they're green, curved, and inviting and enclosed. But you also need to respect people's choice. You can't mandate or prescribe the use of a space in a certain way, and you have to give people freedom of that space. Finally, it's essential to survey afterwards to make sure that people are responding to the intervention in the way that you want them to be. So surveying, which you all did this year so many times, is incredibly important in improving the quality of life in buildings. I want to leave you with one final really powerful tool to start kickstarting change, and that's called point of decision design, or POD. Once you have an idea of what people want for their space, you can use point of decision design to help make them make the healthier choice the easier choice. If this is still a bit confusing, let's look at an example. You first have to identify the undesirable choice. Looking at the example of our commons, maybe it's that the commons often becomes a thoroughfare during passing period and no one ever sits and has conversations there. You identify the moment of decision when people decide, I don't want to be here. Maybe that's at the entryway or when they're passing by and don't see any comfortable chairs. And then you make the desirable choice easier. And in this simple way, you can encourage people to use spaces in ways that are healthier for them. If this is still confusing, let's look at the example of plastic waste. Undesirable solution in this case is the plastic waste. The moment of decision, happens in the grocery store when you're getting that plastic bag, and making the easier choice, the healthier choice is as simple as just adding biodegradable bags. So when you do things like that, when you take control and when you use what we know about neuroscience in terms of our evolutionary past and how people make decisions, you can shape healthier spaces for everybody. Here's what our commons could look like if we applied these principles. And I want to leave you with this, that you can change your space. And that if something doesn't feel right, whether it's a light bulb or the absence of a potted plant or just no natural light in the space, if something makes you feel wrong or irks you about the space, pay attention to that, because your brain is the best neuroscience measuring tool that you have. Trust your intuition and know that you can make changes to make the built environment healthier for you and everybody. Thank you all so much for your time here today.
Awesome, Craig. Awesome.
Yes.
Whoa, that was so amazing, Craig.
Amazing. Incredible.
Mind blown.
So informative.
Yes.
Thank you all so much. Does anyone have any questions? I forgot to ask.
I do.
Oh
Craig,
yes, Fleur.
so how did you get interested in this? How did you discover this field?
So I can send out, if anyone's interested, email me, because I have some great books on this subject that can probably explain it even a little better than I did. One of them is Sarah Williams Goldhagen's Welcome to Your World, How the Built Environment Shapes Our Lives. And it's all about how there's no such thing as a neutral space. Spaces either affect us positively or negatively, and it's all about making spaces that affect us positively.
Wow. And to that point, I did ask you this on the chat to you privately. What do you make of, is there anything in terms of emotional connections to certain buildings?
Absolutely. So that's called place attachment. And by making places more sticky, it's what it's called in the terminology, you can help people love them more. So one thing that a researcher talked about was actually adding the principles that were listed in the presentation, but also adding face-like forms. It makes people want to emotionally connect with the buildings more.
Final question. Can you please run for president in about 8 years? I think
Thank
we
you,
all will
Fleur.
vote for you in campaign. It'll be a brilliant campaign.
Thank you all so much. And I don't want to take up any more of Emily's time.
You know, I think Jacob has one question. If you wanted to ask that real quick, Jacob.
Oh, I was just going to say how I saw this video essay recently, or article or something, about how open office spaces has actually backfired because people feel really exposed in them. And it almost seems counterproductive at first, but I just thought it was really interesting how you touched on that, of how actually kind of being enclosed makes us feel better, kind of like cats who hide in boxes, you know? It's not really that much safer, but it makes them feel better, you know? I just thought that was really cool.
It's it's exactly the same thing. That's a great connection, Jacob.
Sarah, did you have a question?
No, I'm good. But great job, Craig.
No, Sarah Winfred, did you have a question, Sarah?
Yeah, I was gonna ask, how did you like brainstorm those ideas for like the commons and the big room, like architecturally or like design-wise?
So I have a little PDF that I can send to people if you're interested that has some of the basic principles. And it's really just about looking at the space and then saying, okay, what's it missing? So in our commons case, it was missing a sense of enclosure. It was missing plants. And I think that was it. So, and seating arrangements that are more comfortable for people to be in. So then I went through and added those three things because those were what were missing from like the evolutionary design standpoint.